In Joel chapter 2 and verse 32, which is quoted twice, once by Peter and once by Paul in the New Testament, it says, "It shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be deliverance, as the Lord has said, among the remnant whom the Lord calls." The remnant of Israel will be saved. Micah 2:12 says, "I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel." Notice, all of you, O Jacob, sounds like the whole nation. Then he clarifies, the remnant of Israel, all of you who are in the remnant. You see, when the Bible says you're going to gather all the Jews back to their land, he means all the remnant. And this passage uses both phrases. He says, "Surely I will assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep of the fold, like the flock in the midst of their pasture." Micah 5:3, which is right after the verse about the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem. Micah 5:2 is the famous verse about Bethlehem being the birthplace of the Messiah. The next verse says, "Therefore he shall give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel." In Micah 7:18, it says, "Who is a God like you, pardoning the iniquity and passing over the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in mercy." Zephaniah 3:13 says, "The remnant of Israel shall do no unrighteousness and speak no lies, nor shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth, for they shall feed their flocks and lie down, and no one shall make them afraid." Interestingly, there it talks about the remnant of Israel, says they will speak no lies, and no deceitful tongue will be found in their mouth. Do you remember what Jesus said when he saw Nathanael coming to him in John chapter 1? He said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." That means no deceitful tongue. A true Israelite, part of the remnant. "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." You know, when you read about the 144,000 in Revelation 14, in the first 3 verses, or 5 verses, it's describing the 144,000. It says, "In their mouth there is no guile." What's that mean? They're the remnant. We're talking about the remnant here, because Zephaniah said the remnant of Israel, there'll be no deceitful tongue, that's guile, in their mouth. They shall feed their flocks, etc. Zechariah 14:2 says, "For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem." By the way, this is often referred in dispensational teaching to Armageddon. I believe it's about 80-70. But anyway, it says, "I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city." The true Israel, the true Jerusalem will survive this Holocaust. And they will be the new Jerusalem. They will be the heavenly Jerusalem, the church of the firstborn, as it says in Hebrews chapter 12, which we'll look at later today. One other verse about the remnant here. This doesn't use the word remnant, but I've shown you this in an earlier lecture. In Psalm 50, in verse 5, God says, "Gather my saints," that's holy ones, "together to me, those who have made a covenant with me by sacrifice." But then down a few verses later, in verses 16 and 17 of the same psalm, he says, "But to the wicked," God says, "what right do you have to declare my statutes, or to take my covenant in your mouth, seeing you hate instruction and cast my words behind you?" Now, what's interesting here is he calls his faithful saints, the faithful remnant, are the ones who are in a covenant relationship with him, those who've made a covenant by sacrifice, he says. But then he contrasts them with the wicked, who also take God's covenant on their mouth. Certainly they're Jewish. No Gentiles ever took Yahweh's covenant on their mouth. He's talking to Jewish people, but they're wicked people, like most of them were. And he's saying to the wicked, he says, "What right do you have to claim my covenant? What right do you have to name my name on your lips? You hate me. In other words, you're not my people. You may be Jewish, but you hate me. You're wicked. You put my words behind your back. You have no right," he says, "to take my covenant on your lips." In other words, the promises God made are covenant promises to Israel, but they apply to the covenant faithful of Israel, the remnant. They do not apply to the wicked, the rebellious, the apostate. And we ought to know that because, frankly, think of how many generations since Christ of human beings, not including Jews, have lived and died and lived and died. And what happened to the apostate Jews? They lived, they died apostate, they're lost. Right? So obviously the promises of salvation are to the faithful remnant. What has happened in all those generations to the Jews who believed in Christ? They've died too, but they're saved. See, the promises are fulfilled to the faithful remnant, not to the ethnic Israel as a whole. And that's why Paul says they are not all Israel who are of Israel. Those who are of Israel would mean the whole nation. The Israel that not all of them are is the faithful remnant. And so the Bible teaches that these promises, even about the regathering of his people, are fulfilled to a remnant. One thing that many people don't tell you when they're teaching the Old Testament prophecies about the regathering of the people of Israel to their land is that all those prophecies were uttered before the Jews returned from Babylon. Does that seem significant at all in the interpretation of prophecy? Isaiah and Jeremiah wrote before the Babylonian exile. Ezekiel and Daniel wrote in the middle of that exile. 9 of the minor prophets wrote before the exile too. None of the prophets wrote after the exile, except for Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi. And they do not make predictions about return of the exile, except Zechariah makes one prediction, but he wrote while they were still coming back. You see, there was a season after the 70 years of captivity when the Jews had been taken out of the land, Jerusalem had been burned down, the temple had been burned down. The Jews had been banished from the land by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar. They were in 70 years in Babylon in captivity. And then in 3 waves they came back. The remnant did. Not all of them. Most of the Jews still stayed in Babylon, and their descendants are still out there in Gentile lands. They've never returned to Israel. That's what the rabbis are waiting for all those people to come back to Israel. They don't realize they're not the remnant. The promise is about the remnant. They came back with Zerubbabel around 538 BC, and more of them came back later with Ezra, and more of them came back with Nehemiah. But it was during the time of Zerubbabel in the first group that Zechariah prophesied, and he also predicted God bringing the Jews back, but there were still 2 more waves of them to come back after that, with Ezra and Nehemiah. So after those waves happened, there were no more prophecies about anyone bringing the Jews back to Israel, including in the New Testament. The New Testament has not one reference to the Jews coming back to Israel. Not a reference of any kind. I know some people use, Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved, which we'll look at tonight. But it doesn't say they begin in the land of Israel. I'm saved, and I'm not in the land of Israel. To say all Israel will be saved tells you nothing about where they will be on the planet when they're saved. Being saved means coming to Christ. And you can do that anywhere. So you'll find not one hint in the New Testament that Jesus or the apostles believed that the Jews who were still scattered abroad, even when they were here on the earth, will ever come back to Israel. Ever since 722 BC, when the Assyrians drove the northern kingdom out of their land, and 586 when Nebuchadnezzar took Judah out of their land, that's like 500 years before Christ. Ever since then, there has never been a moment in history that the majority of Jews have been in Israel. The vast majority have lived throughout the lands of the Gentiles. Still is true. There's about 14 million Jews in the world today. About 6 million live in Israel. Not even half. There's almost as many living in America. And there's Jews living in all nations still. So if all Jews are to be gathered back, it's still future. Sometimes people say, we're seeing history fulfilled. The Jews are all pouring back to Israel. Well, not all of them. Most of the Jews I know here in America that I've talked to don't have plans to move. Some do, but not many. What I'm saying to you is that from about 586 BC to the present day, there's never been one moment where the majority of Jews lived in the land. That means when Jesus was here and the apostles were here, most of the Jews were scattered in the diaspora. And yet Jesus never uttered a word about bringing them back. The apostles never uttered a word about having any expectation that they'd come back. Why? Because the prophecies about the return of the exiles to the land were fulfilled 5 centuries before Christ. When Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah brought the exiles from Babylon back, that's the fulfillment. I mean, naturally speaking, you'd think it was. If you have Micah predicting that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, and then about 4 BC, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, you say, oh, that's the fulfillment. Why? Because it was predicted beforehand and it happened later. But nobody is saying, but Jesus has to be born in Bethlehem again in the last days. Why? No need for it. He was born there once. You don't need to, it doesn't have to happen again. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there were no later predictions that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. You know why? Because it had happened. It had been fulfilled. The prophets, including Deuteronomy, Moses, they predicted a return of the people to the promised land, and it happened 500 years before Jesus was ever born. Since that time, not one prediction has been made by any inspired prophet about a return of the exiles. One gets the impression that it was fulfilled. The remnant did return to Babylon. By the way, if you look back at the verses we talked about first, notice they talk about God bringing Israel back from their captivity. The Jews throughout the world aren't in captivity right now. I don't think the 5 million Jews in America are in captivity anywhere. They can go wherever they want to go. They're not in captivity. They're not like the Babylonian captivity. I mean, Jews in most countries can go wherever they want to go. There's no captivity. I mean, there may be, Jews in communist lands that can't leave at will, but neither can the Gentiles. This is not a Jewish captivity. There's just a slave state that doesn't let anyone move freely about. But the Jews as a people have not been in captivity since they came back from Babylon. Therefore, all these prophecies, which all speak of God bringing back from their captivity in all the nations, and bringing back the land, well, he did bring them back from their captivity, and they haven't been in captivity since. So, where is the basis in any of these prophecies to think of something happening in the last days? Now, people sometimes ask me, someone asked me just the other day, and I get asked it many times, well, could there be double fulfillment? Well, if the Jews go into captivity again, I guess there could be. If they go into captivity again in the future, and he could get them out of captivity, but they haven't been in captivity for thousands of years, and I don't think they're going into captivity again. And therefore, there won't be any need for a second deliverance from captivity for them. The dispensationalists say that the return of the exiles from Babylon were not the ultimate return, obviously. They know that the remnant returned from Babylon. But dispensationalists say, but there's got to be much more of a large-scale return to the land than that. Although even dispensational authors will say, really, they only expect a remnant. They don't expect every last Jew on the planet to go to Israel. Some might, but not dispensational scholars, though. It is not the view of the dispensational position that every last Jew will return to Israel. Just most of them, just a huge number of them. Well, that hasn't happened yet either, but the point is they're still only looking for a remnant, only a portion of the nation to come back. And like I said, that's what happened in 539 BC. A remnant came back. And there were no predictions about it again after that. So on what basis would anyone who's a sensible Bible scholar say that there's still unfulfilled promises here? Well, the truth is there are some things in some of those prophecies about the return that did not happen in the days of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. And because those things didn't happen, dispensationalists will say, well, these prophecies have a future fulfillment because those things didn't happen. Let's see what things those were. First of all, if you look at Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, it says, "It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Assyria and Egypt, Pathros and Cush, Elam and Shinar, from Hamath and the islands of the sea. He will set up a banner for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." Now, of course, in general, this sounds very much like all the other predictions about God bringing back his remnant. It even uses the word remnant here. It even identifies it as the remnant. But the issue here was the Lord will do it again a second time. Okay, we recognize that God did bring them back from Babylon. That's true. But this specifically says there'll be another time, a second time. He'll again set forth his hand to bring the remnant back. So there is a second fulfillment. But is there? What is this actually talking about? First of all, Isaiah 11, what is it talking about? If you look at verse 1, it says, there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. This is Jesus, his birth. It's not his second coming, by the way. Jesus isn't going to come back out of the root of Jesse. He came the first time through the root of Jesse. He's not going to come back out of Jesse's line again. He's coming out of heaven next time. This is the first coming of Christ that's talking about. In fact, verse 10 is quoted by Paul as being fulfilled already. In Isaiah 11:10 says, and in that day there shall be a root of Jesse who shall stand as a banner to the people, for the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious. Now this verse 10, is quoted by Paul in Romans 15:12. Paul gives a string of several verses in a row in Romans 15 about how that his ministry to the Gentiles was predicted in the Old Testament. This is one of the verses he quotes. A banner, the Lord will raise up a banner, and all the nations will come to him. He sees Jesus as the banner, and the evangelism of the Gentiles and them coming to Jesus is the fulfillment. Paul, an inspired writer, said that this verse is about his ministry, and no doubt the continuing ministry of the Gentiles forever after. He doesn't put it off to the end times. It was in his times that it was being fulfilled as a result of the first coming of Christ. Now, furthermore, when he says in verse 11, the Lord will do it a second time, what was the first time he's talking about? Look at the last verse in this chapter, verse 16. There will be a highway for the remnant of his people who will be left from Assyria, as it was for Israel in the day that he came up from the land of Egypt. Isn't that the first time? This second time, when God draws them, it'll be like the first time when he brought them out of Egypt. In other words, this is not suggesting that the return of the exiles from Babylon was the first time, and the second time will be in the end times at the end of the world. No, the first time God gathered his people out of foreign lands to the promised land was when he brought them out of Egypt. The second time was out of Babylon. Okay? So this reference to a second time doesn't refer to the end times. If anything, the return of the Babylonian exiles is the second time. The first time was the Exodus. And by the way, it's very important that we note this at this point. We'll see it in many passages. In the Old Testament, the Exodus from Egypt and the return of the exiles from Babylon are treated almost as if they're the same kind of thing. They're the two times in Israel's history that the whole nation was essentially out of their land,